I have the responsibility of reporting on the second workshop devoted to the food challenge.
So, we started with an observation, which is the observation of what happened in the marketplaces, the increase in prices in the spring of 2008 and during the summer of 2010, the multiplication by two of the price of wheat, maize, and soya. So, aside from all of this, and looking at the role played by speculators in this price hike, I think that we were able to conclude that this is a message of alert from the marketplace, a message that we considered to be a major challenge for the 21st century, the challenge of food security, food safety. Even though we might be a little more optimistic as regards demographic figures, but in 2 generations, there's no doubt that the planet will have to be able to multiply by two its agricultural production to be able to meet the food needs of mankind, but not taking into account energy needs, simply food needs. In a context where there is very little arable land or new arable land, very little land that can be deforested, so we needed to multiply by two the yields that we currently experience. So there's a challenge that has to be met, and we discussed several experiences. The case of India, first of all, and then the case of Kazakhstan. As regards the case of India, this was very well presented by Mr. Dorat, a very interesting case, and we should remember that India is a major success as regards the Green Revolution. The major challenge that India had to meet was in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. That was for 1.4 billion inhabitants to reach food self-sufficiency, and they achieved this. So there was the idea of the Green Revolution, and the Green Revolution essentially was seen as being the introduction of new hybrid, high-yield seeds. But similarly to this, and in parallel, there was a rural and agricultural policy that was implemented that actually survived whatever the difficulties that were experienced and whatever message came from Washington in particular and the World Bank during a period. So in India, there were not the food riots that were experienced in 2008 in a number of other countries. This being said, India is obviously re-examining its agricultural policies, not so much as regards self-sufficiency, but as regards the global food safety approach. And there are still 150 million people who go hungry. Then the case of Kazakhstan, that of course was a very rich area, cereal grain-wise, for the USSR, the former USSR. A number of very interesting experiments took place in the days of the older USSR, and what is striking in the case of Kazakhstan is the fact that it rebounded following the collapse of the USSR, and Kazakhstan is today a major exporter of grain and cereals, and represents a very, very high potential for new investments and to develop new agricultural produce. So there is a challenge that has to be met in the food sector, and there are various solutions that can be contemplated in this respect. Of course, what comes to mind immediately are technological solutions, and we, of course, discussed the GMO issue, the issue of biotechnologies, and it is observed today, as is done in certain countries, including a country to the north of Morocco on the other side of the Mediterranean. It is really not reasonable to not take into account these new biotechnologies, even though they might not be the unique solution or the panacea. And they do give rise to some difficulties, but it is very clear that biotechnologies, well managed, are part and parcel of the solutions. We also discussed the issue relating to the best use of current techniques and technologies, in particular the issue of a second generation of fertilizers. And we know today that it would be possible to much better use some of the fertilizers nitrogen fertilizers in particular, with better consequences on the environment. And it is not. It is quite useful to point out that there is a lot of mergers and acquisitions taking place in the area of fertilizers. There was a hostile takeover recently between the two major players in this area. And then phosphates, of course, were in Morocco, and there was a lot of polemics. The question was to know whether there would be a peak of phosphates, and the studies available show that this is not the case. So there are 300 or 400 years of reserves of phosphates, but what we know is that Morocco is going to play a very important role in this area. It's going to be a challenge that will have to be met by Morocco to be the supplier of phosphates for the planet over the next few years, because phosphates are totally indispensable. We cannot do without them. So what was also very interesting in this workshop was to see that we should look beyond techniques and technologies, that we should also look at agricultural and rural policies, that there is a challenge in the area of food security in sub-Saharan Africa, which is to recreate agricultural policies worthy of their name, looking at the Indian system with credit mechanisms to be able to reintegrate farmers in the financial system. And, of course, the taxpayer and the consumer will pay for this through subsidies or through higher prices. And what do we do in countries where consumers can't afford to buy more expensive produce, or where there are no taxpayers? And then, of course, international aid is very important, and foundations such as the Gates foundations in Western Africa come into play. And a third avenue is that of world governance. And there is no world governance in this area of food security currently. FAO is a non-existent structure, even though one should pay tribute to the work carried out by PAM, the World Food Programme, WFP, PAM in French, but for emergency situations only. And there, a little later, we might listen to what Jean-Daniel Lévy has to say in this respect, but because as regards the French program for the G8, G20 for next year, we know that there is a problem that is of agricultural regulation. And the question is to know whether it should be increased stabilization, increased regulation, legislation, and this is at the very heart of the French presidency of the G8, G20. In conclusion, I would like to come back to what Mr. Dorat said yesterday, and he actually raised a question. He put a question to Jean-Claude Trichet, he's an Indian central banker. As regards the Central Bank of India, it is very concerned by agricultural policies. It played a very important role in the development of the rural credit mechanism. I am not going to ask Jean-Claude Trichet to look after the common agricultural policy, but I'm wondering whether a number of central banks of developing countries should not place agriculture at the heart of their concerns. And he said that it was necessary to fight against fatigue, fatigue of land, fatigue of science, fatigue of policies. We have to place these issues at center stage in the limelight. This is something that is very important. There's a lot of fatigue of technologies, of policies, etc. And I do believe that this was a wonderful message that we heard yesterday. Of course, there are energy and climate challenges that will have to be met. But in the 21st century, as happened in the past actually, the problem of feeding mankind is a central issue for a population that will soon amount to 9 billion people. Thank you.